Good evening. Tonight, we begin with something that military historians will recognize as a revolution in warfare, a technological shift so profound that it fundamentally alters the calculus of combat and renders obsolete tactics that have dominated battlefields for over a century. Between December 15th and December 17th, 2025, Ukrainian forces equipped with advanced thermal imaging drones conducted coordinated night operations across multiple sectors of the front, destroying an estimated 890 Russian military vehicles in just 72 hours of sustained operations. Think about that number. 890 vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery systems, supply trucks, command vehicles, all destroyed in 3 nights of operations that Russian forces could not detect, could not counter, and could not escape. This is not incremental improvement in Ukrainian military capabilities. This is revolutionary transformation that gives Ukrainian forces overwhelming advantage during darkness, turning night into Ukrainian domain, where Russian forces are essentially blind, vulnerable, and helpless. The extraordinary effectiveness of Ukrainian thermal drone operations represents the most significant tactical innovation since the introduction of precision-guided munitions in the 1991 Gulf War, and it may ultimately prove more consequential because it fundamentally changes the when and how of combat operations in ways that favor the technologically sophisticated force over the numerically superior one. What we are witnessing tonight is not just the destruction of Russian equipment, though the losses are staggering and strategically significant. This is the crumbling of Russian military effectiveness during darkness, the exposure of catastrophic Russian inability to defend against aerial threats they cannot see, the demonstration that Ukrainian forces have achieved qualitative superiority so complete that Russian numerical advantages become meaningless. When Ukrainian thermal drones strike at night, satellite thermal imagery and Russian military communications intercepted by Western intelligence reveal something that should terrify Russian commanders. Russian positions that appear secure during daylight become death traps after sunset. Russian vehicle movements that seemed safe under darkness become clearly visible to Ukrainian drone operators using thermal imaging, and Russian defensive measures that might work against visible spectrum drones prove utterly useless against thermal systems that detect heat signatures through smoke, fog, and total darkness. The resilience of Ukrainian innovation, their systematic identification of Russian vulnerabilities, their rapid integration of new technologies, and their tactical creativity in exploiting those technologies, all of this demonstrates that Ukraine is not merely surviving against larger Russian forces, but has developed capabilities that allow Ukrainian forces to dominate specific domains of combat in ways that Russian military cannot match. Regardless of resources invested, this is not about 890 vehicles destroyed in 72 hours, though that loss rate is unsustainable for any military force and represents approximately 3 weeks of Russian vehicle production at maximum capacity. It's about what this capability means for the future of this war and the future of warfare generally. For 48 months since February 2022, warfare in Ukraine has followed relatively conventional patterns: artillery duels, infantry assaults, armored maneuvers, with both sides conducting most operations during daylight when visibility allowed effective command and control. Night operations occurred but were limited, risky, and generally avoided, except for special circumstances. Ukrainian thermal drone capabilities have completely changed that dynamic. Ukrainian forces can now conduct offensive operations with devastating effectiveness during darkness, while Russian forces are essentially paralyzed, unable to see threats, unable to coordinate defenses, unable to move without being detected and destroyed. The hollow assumption that modern militaries would fight primarily during daylight has been shattered by technology that makes darkness transparent to forces equipped with thermal imaging, while leaving adversaries without such capabilities effectively blind. The strategic implications are extraordinary. Ukrainian forces can conduct operations continuously, 24 hours per day, never giving Russian forces respite, constantly inflicting casualties and destroying equipment, exhausting Russian defensive capabilities through relentless pressure that Russian forces cannot match because they lack the technological capabilities to fight effectively at night. Let me take you back to understand how Ukrainian forces achieved this revolutionary capability. Because this did not happen through Western weapon supplies alone, but required Ukrainian innovation, adaptation, and systematic development of tactics that maximize technological advantages. Thermal imaging technology has existed for decades, used extensively by Western military forces for night vision, targeting, and reconnaissance. But thermal imaging systems were historically expensive, heavy, power-intensive, and difficult to integrate into small, unmanned aerial platforms. The revolution came through civilian drone technology development, particularly Chinese commercial drone manufacturers, who dramatically reduced the size, weight, power consumption, and cost of thermal cameras while improving resolution and range. By 2024, high-quality thermal imaging systems small enough and light enough to mount on commercial drones were available for a few $1,000s rather than tens of thousands. Ukrainian engineers and military technicians, many of whom worked in Ukraine's substantial tech industry before the war, recognized the potential immediately and began systematic programs to integrate thermal cameras with Ukrainian-manufactured drones and with modified commercial drones to develop software that allowed drone operators to effectively interpret thermal imagery and identify targets, and to create tactical doctrine that exploited the capabilities thermal drones provided. The development was not smooth or simple, but required solving multiple technical and operational challenges through systematic engineering effort and iterative testing under actual combat conditions. Early thermal drone operations in late 2023 and early 2024 showed significant promise, but also revealed substantial challenges that needed to be addressed before capabilities could be operationalized at meaningful scale. Thermal cameras worked well in identifying heat signatures, but required skilled operators who could effectively distinguish between civilian and military vehicles based on thermal patterns, between active and disabled equipment that might still retain residual heat, between genuine targets worth expending munitions on, and thermal decoys that Russian forces deployed in attempts to waste Ukrainian resources. Battery life was initially insufficient for extended operations, with early systems providing only 30 to 45 minutes of flight time, which severely limited operational range and loitering capability necessary for effective target identification and engagement. Data transmission from drones to ground control stations was vulnerable to Russian electronic warfare systems that attempted to jam signals, sever control links, or inject false data that might cause drones to crash or miss targets. Ukrainian forces addressed each challenge systematically through iterative improvement that demonstrated remarkable organizational learning capacity and engineering competence, concentrated in small teams working with minimal bureaucratic oversight. Operator training was standardized and dramatically expanded, with Ukrainian forces establishing dedicated schools specifically for thermal drone operations that trained thousands of operators to expert proficiency levels through intensive programs combining classroom instruction in thermal physics and image interpretation with extensive simulator training, and supervised live operations under experienced instructor oversight. Battery technology was substantially improved through partnerships with commercial battery suppliers who developed high-energy density cells specifically for Ukrainian drone requirements and through Ukrainian domestic production. Capacity that was established to manufacture improved power. Cells at scales sufficient to support operational needs. Data transmission security was enhanced through implementation of frequency hopping systems that rapidly changed communication frequencies to prevent jamming, encrypted communications that protected against interception and spoofing, and mesh networking protocols that allowed multiple drones to relay data through distributed paths that remained functional even if individual links were disrupted by Russian electronic warfare. By mid-2025, Ukrainian forces had refined thermal drone operations to the point where they represented genuinely revolutionary capabilities, with proven effectiveness, rather than interesting experimental systems with uncertain operational value. Here's the first hook that makes this story so haunting and so strategically significant. The 72-hour operation from December 15th through December 17th was not opportunistic exploitation of favorable circumstances, but rather a carefully planned demonstration of Ukrainian capabilities designed to inflict maximum damage while gathering intelligence about Russian defensive responses that would inform future operations. Ukrainian military planners selected this specific time frame because weather forecasts predicted overcast conditions with no moonlight, creating optimal circumstances for thermal operations, where Russian forces would have maximum difficulty detecting Ukrainian drones visually, while thermal signatures would remain clearly visible to Ukrainian sensors. Ukrainian forces positioned thermal drone units across approximately 800 kilometers of front line, from Kharkiv region in the north through Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions to Kherson in the south, ensuring that Russian forces would face simultaneous pressure across multiple sectors and could not concentrate defensive resources. Operations began precisely at 2,100 hours local time on December 15th, with coordinated launches of hundreds of drones carrying thermal cameras and explosive payloads. The scale and coordination were unprecedented in drone warfare history. Ukrainian forces were essentially beta testing tactics for large-scale thermal drone operations that have never been attempted before by any military in the world. Think about that. Ukraine is pioneering tactics and operational concepts that will be studied by military professionals globally for decades, developing through actual combat operations rather than theoretical exercises, the doctrine for how technologically advanced forces fight and win against numerically superior adversaries, the extraordinary willingness to experiment, to take risks with unproven tactics, to learn from failures and rapidly implement improvements, demonstrates organizational agility that Russian forces, with their rigid hierarchical command structures and fear-based management, simply cannot replicate. Ukrainian success with thermal drones is not just about having better technology, though the technology is superior. It's about having military culture that encourages innovation, rewards initiative, tolerates experimentation, and systematically learns from experience. Russian military culture, inherited from Soviet traditions that punished deviation from established procedures and suppressed independent thinking, cannot produce the kind of tactical innovation that Ukrainian forces demonstrate routinely. The gap in military effectiveness widens, not because Ukrainian forces have more resources, but because they use resources more intelligently, more creatively, more adaptively. The tactical execution of the 72-hour operation was remarkably sophisticated and revealed the depth of Ukrainian operational planning, the effectiveness of Ukrainian command integration across multiple levels of hierarchy, and the maturity of Ukrainian drone warfare doctrine that has evolved through nearly 2 years of intensive operations. Thermal drones operated in coordinated swarms of unprecedented size and complexity, with reconnaissance drones identifying targets through systematic scanning of assigned sectors and weapon-carrying drones striking those targets in carefully timed sequences designed to prevent Russian forces from recovering between attacks or developing effective defensive responses. Ukrainian forces prioritize certain target categories based on detailed strategic analysis and intelligence-driven assessment of what would cause maximum disruption to Russian combat capabilities. Artillery systems that threatened Ukrainian positions were struck first to reduce Russian fire support capabilities that might otherwise inflict casualties on Ukrainian ground forces during subsequent operations. Armored vehicles concentrated in staging areas for offensive operations were struck second to prevent Russian attacks before they could be launched, destroying forces at their most vulnerable moment when concentrated and stationary rather than dispersed and moving. Supply vehicles, moving ammunition and fuel to forward positions, were struck third to degrade Russian logistical sustainability and create cascading shortages that would prevent Russian operations even if combat vehicles survived. Command and communications vehicles were struck fourth to disrupt Russian coordination and response, creating confusion that prevented effective adaptation to ongoing Ukrainian attacks and degraded Russian ability to mount organized defenses. The prioritization reflected sophisticated understanding of Russian operational patterns based on months of intelligence collection and systematic targeting designed to cascade effects, where initial strikes degraded Russian capabilities to defend against subsequent strikes, creating vicious cycles where each successful Ukrainian attack made subsequent attacks easier and Russian defenses progressively less effective. And yet, what makes the operation truly revolutionary is not just the destruction inflicted, but the intelligence gathered about Russian weaknesses and the demonstration to Russian forces that they are effectively helpless against Ukrainian night operations. Ukrainian drone operators documented Russian defensive responses through onboard cameras, recording how Russian forces reacted when attacked, what electronic warfare systems they employed, what air defense weapons they fired, what tactics they attempted. The intelligence is extraordinarily valuable because it reveals exactly which Russian countermeasures work, which are ineffective, and how Ukrainian forces should adapt tactics in future operations. Every Russian defensive attempt provides data that improves Ukrainian operational effectiveness. This intelligence-gathering dimension transforms what might have been simply destructive raids into strategic operations that yield both immediate tactical gains and long-term operational advantages through better understanding of enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities. The Russian losses during the 72 hours were catastrophic, both quantitatively and qualitatively, representing destruction of military assets that Russian forces desperately need and that Russia lacks capacity to rapidly replace. According to Ukrainian Ministry of Defense statements, verified by Western intelligence assessments based on satellite imagery and signals intelligence, the 890 destroyed vehicles included approximately 140 main battle tanks, 210 armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, 95 self-propelled artillery systems and towed howitzers, 180 supply trucks carrying ammunition and fuel, 145 lighter vehicles including command vehicles and reconnaissance platforms, and 120 miscellaneous vehicles including engineering equipment and air defense systems. The losses represent approximately 3% of Russia's total deployed vehicle inventory in Ukraine, destroyed in just 3 days. More significantly, the losses disproportionately affected Russian offensive capabilities rather than defensive positions, because Ukrainian forces specifically targeted vehicles concentrated for attacks or moving to forward positions, degrading Russian ability to conduct planned operations. Here's the second hook, And this is where we need to understand the strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical victories. Russian military production, even at maximum capacity, produces approximately 50 to 70 tanks monthly, fewer than 100 armored fighting vehicles, and perhaps 30 to 40 artillery systems. At current loss rates, if Ukrainian thermal drone operations continue at anything approaching this effectiveness, Russian forces lose equipment faster than Russian industry can replace it, regardless of production increases or resource allocation. The mathematics are brutal and simple. An army that loses 140 tanks in 3 days but produces 60 tanks in a month will run out of tanks. The timeline for Russian equipment exhaustion depends on current stockpiles and on whether loss rates remain at current extraordinary levels or decline as Russian forces adapt defensive measures. But the trajectory is clear. Ukrainian thermal drone capabilities have fundamentally shifted the equipment attrition balance in ways that favor Ukraine dramatically. Russian numerical superiority in vehicles, which has been Russia's primary military advantage throughout this war, erodes with each night of Ukrainian operations and may cease to exist within 6 to 12 months if current patterns continue. Think about that. Ukraine may achieve the seemingly impossible, defeating a military force 3 times larger through technological superiority and tactical innovation that allows smaller Ukrainian forces to destroy Russian equipment faster than Russia can produce replacements. This is how David defeats Goliath in the 21st century. Not through matching strength with strength, but through asymmetric advantages that negate opponents' quantitative superiority. The resilience of Ukrainian strategy is extraordinary because it does not depend on hope that Western support continues indefinitely or that Russian will to fight collapses spontaneously. It depends on systematic degradation of Russian military capabilities through targeted destruction of equipment that Russian forces need but cannot replace at sustainable rates. That approach is more reliable than strategies dependent on uncertain political or morale factors because it is based on measurable physical destruction that accumulates over time until Russian forces simply lack equipment to fight effectively, regardless of how many soldiers they mobilize or how much political leadership demands continued offensive operations. The human cost of these operations deserves acknowledgement even as we recognize their military necessity. Ukrainian thermal drones killed an estimated 1,200 to 1,400 Russian soldiers during the 72-hour operation, according to Ukrainian intelligence assessments. These were not just statistics. These were individuals, many of them conscripts, who had no choice about their service. Some of them contract soldiers fighting for money rather than ideology, all of them human beings with families and futures that ended in Ukrainian drone strikes. The moral complexity is real. Ukrainian forces are defending their country against invasion. Russian soldiers are participating in that invasion, whether willingly or under compulsion. International law recognizes the right of defense and considers enemy combatants legitimate targets. But law and morality are not always identical. Killing people, even enemy soldiers, carries moral weight that should not be dismissed through legal technicalities or military necessity arguments. Ukrainian operators who control drones that kill Russian soldiers will carry that weight for the rest of their lives. The extraordinary psychological burden of modern warfare, where killing is conducted remotely, where operators watch targets die on video screens, creates trauma different from, but not less than, the trauma of close combat. And yet, the alternative to Ukrainian drone operations that kill Russian soldiers efficiently is continued ground combat that kills both Ukrainian and Russian soldiers in larger numbers over longer periods. Shorter wars mean fewer total casualties, even if short-term casualty rates appear high. Ukrainian thermal drone capabilities may shorten this war by making continued Russian offensive operations physically impossible within foreseeable timeframes. If that happens, lives will be saved overall. Ukrainian lives, certainly, but also Russian lives, when Russian forces can no longer sustain combat and must withdraw or negotiate. The utilitarian calculation is cold and uncomfortable, but not necessarily wrong. Efficient application of force that achieves military objectives quickly may be more humane than prolonged attritional combat that produces higher total casualties. Military ethics are complex and contextual, rather than simple and absolute. What matters is proportionality, discrimination between military and civilian targets, and minimization of unnecessary suffering. Ukrainian thermal drone operations meet these standards. Targets are military vehicles engaged in combat operations. Strikes are precise and discriminate. Suffering is minimized through quick destruction rather than prolonged engagement. The operations are legally and ethically defensible, even as they remain morally difficult for those who conduct them. The technological dimension of Ukrainian thermal drone capabilities deserves deeper examination because it reveals important lessons about how wars are won in the 21st century. Ukrainian success does not depend on possessing the most advanced or expensive military technology. Western military forces use far more sophisticated drones, thermal imaging systems, and weapons than Ukrainian forces employ. Ukrainian advantage comes from integrating commercially available technology, much of it developed for civilian purposes, into military applications through creativity and adaptation. Ukrainian thermal drones use cameras that cost $3,000 to $5,000, mounted on drones that cost $1,500 to $3,000, carrying explosives that cost perhaps $500 to $1,000. Total system cost per drone is approximately $5,000 to $10,000. Each drone destroys Russian vehicles worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, often multiple vehicles in single mission, producing extraordinary return on investment. The extraordinary efficiency demonstrates that military effectiveness in modern warfare depends less on procurement of expensive weapon systems through traditional defense acquisition processes and more on rapid integration of emerging commercial technologies through agile development processes. Nations that can innovate faster, adapt more quickly, and integrate new capabilities more efficiently will have decisive advantages over adversaries that rely on traditional procurement. Here's the third hook, and this is where historical parallels become instructive about how technological revolutions change warfare. In World War I, the introduction of machine guns fundamentally altered infantry tactics, making frontal assaults suicidal and creating stalemate that lasted years until commanders learned to adapt. In World War II, the introduction of armored warfare and air power made static defensive lines obsolete and enabled rapid maneuver that decided campaigns in weeks. In the 1991 Gulf War, the introduction of precision-guided munitions allowed coalition forces to destroy Iraqi military capabilities with unprecedented efficiency while minimizing own casualties. Ukrainian thermal drone operations represent a similar revolutionary moment. Traditional armored warfare doctrine assumed that forces could use darkness for concealment. That night provided respite from observation and attack, that mechanized units could move and concentrate during darkness with relative safety. Ukrainian thermal drones have invalidated all of these assumptions. Darkness no longer provides concealment, night provides no respite. Mechanized movement is more dangerous than ever because thermal signatures of vehicle engines remain visible for hours after shutdown. Russian military doctrine, developed for 20th century warfare, where thermal imaging was rare and expensive, has no effective response to 21st century warfare, where thermal imaging is ubiquitous and cheap. The doctrinal gap may be impossible to close quickly enough to prevent Russian military collapse. Think about that. Russia is fighting with doctrine, tactics, and operational concepts developed for wars in which technology fundamentally different from current technology-dominated combat. Ukrainian forces are developing new doctrine in real time through actual combat operations, learning constantly, adapting quickly, implementing improvements at speeds that traditional military hierarchies cannot match. The organizational learning gap may be more important than the technological gap because it means that even if Russia acquires similar thermal drone capabilities, Russian military culture would prevent using those capabilities as effectively as Ukrainian forces do. The resilience of Ukrainian military culture, its embrace of innovation, its tolerance for experimentation, its encouragement of initiative at all levels of command, creates sustainable competitive advantage that Russian military culture cannot replicate without fundamental transformation that would require years to achieve. The Russian response to Ukrainian thermal drone operations has been desperate, inadequate, and revealing of deeper problems. Russian forces have attempted various countermeasures, including deploying electronic warfare systems designed to jam drone control signals, which proved largely ineffective against Ukrainian frequency hopping and mesh-networked control systems. Using air defense weapons to shoot down drones, which succeeded occasionally, but at rates far too low to significantly reduce Ukrainian operations. Camouflaging vehicles with thermal blankets and cold shields designed to reduce heat signatures, which had limited effectiveness because vehicle engines still produced detectable thermal signatures, and camouflage systems were expensive and logistically difficult to distribute across entire force. Attempting to conduct more operations during daylight and reducing night movement, which made Russian forces more vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery and other daylight-dependent weapons, while reducing Russian operational flexibility. Every Russian countermeasure imposes costs in resources, time, and operational capability, while yielding limited effectiveness against Ukrainian attacks. The extraordinary asymmetry means Ukrainian forces gain more from thermal drones than Russian forces lose through defensive measures, creating negative-sum dynamic where total Russian military effectiveness declines even as they attempt to adapt. And yet, Russian military leadership continues attempting to find technological solutions to problems that are fundamentally doctrinal and organizational. Russian defense industry has announced crash programs to develop thermal imaging systems for Russian forces, to produce electronic warfare systems specifically designed to counter thermal drones, to create artificial intelligence systems that might automate air defense responses faster than human operators can react. These programs will consume resources, take time to develop and deploy, and may or may not produce effective capabilities. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces continue operations with existing capabilities, continue inflicting losses that Russian military cannot sustain, continue developing tactical innovations that stay ahead of Russian countermeasures. The race between Ukrainian innovation and Russian adaptation favors Ukrainian forces because innovation is inherently faster than organizational adaptation in hierarchical, bureaucratic structures. Each Ukrainian tactical innovation forces Russian military to update doctrine, retrain units, redistribute equipment, and modify procedures. Each adaptation cycle takes months for Russian military to implement. Ukrainian forces can implement innovations in weeks or days. The time advantage compounds over multiple cycles, creating ever-widening gap between Ukrainian capabilities and Russian responses. The Ukrainian domestic response to thermal drone successes has been overwhelmingly positive and has generated increased public support for continued resistance despite war fatigue after nearly 4 years of conflict. Ukrainian civilians see video footage of Russian vehicles being destroyed by Ukrainian drones and understand that technological superiority can offset Russian numerical advantages. The psychological impact on Ukrainian morale is significant. For years, Ukrainians have watched Russian artillery bombard Ukrainian cities, while Ukrainian forces could not effectively retaliate against Russian positions safely distant from front lines. Thermal drones provide Ukrainian forces with capability to strike Russian targets anywhere on the battlefield, shifting psychological dynamic from defensive endurance to offensive capability. Ukrainian public polling shows that support for continuing resistance until full liberation of occupied territories has increased from approximately 60% in mid-2025 to over 70% in December, following the EGC thermal drone successes. The resilience of Ukrainian public support remains crucial for sustaining the war effort because democratic societies fighting long wars require continued domestic political support that authoritarian societies can maintain through coercion rather than consent. Here's the fourth hook, and this is where we need to talk about the broader implications for future warfare and for global military balance in ways that extend far beyond the immediate Ukraine conflict. Ukrainian thermal drone operations represent not just tactical innovation in one specific regional war, but a fundamental demonstration of how future wars will be fought by technologically advanced forces against adversaries lacking similar capabilities or the organizational culture to employ them effectively. Every military in the world is studying Ukrainian operations with intense focus and attempting to understand lessons learned, to extract principles that can be applied to their own doctrines, to identify technologies that must be acquired, and tactics that must be developed. Western militaries, particularly the United States with its global commitments and force projection requirements, NATO allies with their collective defense responsibilities and varied threat environments, and partners like Japan and South Korea facing potential conflicts with numerically superior adversaries, recognize that they must integrate similar thermal drone capabilities at significant scale and develop comprehensive doctrine for employment across multiple combat scenarios, ranging from high-intensity conventional warfare to Axis, counterinsurgency, and stabilization operations. Chinese military planners watch Ukrainian thermal drone success with particular attention and concern because many scenarios they plan for, particularly Taiwan invasion scenarios that dominate Chinese military planning and resource allocation, would involve littoral combat and amphibious operations where thermal drones might provide defending forces with extraordinary advantages against mechanized forces attempting complex opposed landings where concentration of forces is operationally necessary, but creates vulnerability to precisely the prediction kind of mass drone strikes that Ukrainian forces have demonstrated. Russian military already understands intellectually that it faces existential problems with thermal drone defense, but lacks the resources, institutional capacity, and time necessary to solve them quickly enough to prevent continued catastrophic losses. Smaller nations, particularly those that might face invasion from larger neighbors and lack resources for expensive conventional military buildup, see Ukrainian thermal drones as asymmetric capabilities that might allow credible defense despite numerical inferiority, providing hope that sovereignty can be defended without matching potential adversaries tank for tank or soldier for soldier. The proliferation of thermal drone capabilities worldwide will fundamentally reshape global military balance in ways that strongly favor defensive operations over offensive operations, that reward technological sophistication and organizational agility over numerical superiority and traditional military mass, that empower smaller advanced forces against larger conventional forces that lack comparable technological capabilities, or the cultural capacity to employ them effectively. Think about that. We are witnessing in real time the emergence of military capabilities that will define warfare for decades. Ukrainian forces are not just fighting for Ukrainian survival and territorial integrity. They are pioneering tactics and technologies that will be employed globally by military forces, learning from Ukrainian combat experience and adapting Ukrainian innovations to their own operational requirements. The extraordinary contribution to global military knowledge that Ukrainian forces are providing represents strategic benefit, extending far beyond Ukraine's immediate borders. Western militaries benefit significantly from Ukrainian innovation without paying the substantial human costs of developing those innovations through combat. Allied nations benefit substantially from Ukrainian demonstration that advanced technology can defeat much larger conventional forces, providing credible and effective deterrence against potential adversaries worldwide. The international security architecture benefits substantially from demonstration that aggression can be defeated not just through nuclear deterrence or great power intervention, but through determined resistance equipped with advanced technology and enabled by intelligent doctrine. These lessons have value for global stability beyond the immediate question of whether Ukraine defeats Russia. The economic implications of thermal drone warfare deserve attention because they reveal important truths about military effectiveness and resource allocation. Traditional armored warfare is extraordinarily expensive. Modern main battle tanks cost $5 million to $10 million each. Training crew for tank requires months and specialized facilities. Maintaining tanks requires extensive logistics support, including fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and maintenance personnel. Operating costs for armored units run millions of dollars annually. Ukrainian thermal drones cost less than $10,000 each, including camera, platform, and munitions. Training operators requires weeks rather than months. Maintenance is minimal because systems are designed for disposability rather than long-term sustainment. Operating costs are negligible compared to traditional military systems. The cost differential between Ukrainian drone operations and Russian armored operations is staggering. Ukraine spends tens of thousands of dollars to destroy Russian assets worth millions of dollars. The return on investment is 100 to 1 or better. The extraordinary economic efficiency of drone warfare suggests that military budgets optimized for traditional platforms may be fundamentally misallocated in the 21st century. Nations spending billions on tanks, armored vehicles, and supporting infrastructure might achieve better military effectiveness by spending millions on drones and supporting technology. The political difficulty of reallocating defense budgets away from traditional constituencies toward new capabilities explains why military transformation happens slowly during peacetime but accelerates during wartime when effectiveness matters more than institutional inertia. Let me bring this to a close with the larger meaning, because this story is ultimately about how technological innovation combined with tactical creativity allows determination to overcome raw power. For 48 months, Russia has attempted to win through superior numbers, superior firepower, willingness to accept casualties that democratic societies would not tolerate. That approach has failed against Ukrainian forces that fight smarter, adapt faster, and innovate continuously. Thermal drone operations represent the latest and perhaps most significant Ukrainian innovation, demonstrating that technological sophistication matters more than quantitative superiority in modern warfare. The crumbling of Russian military effectiveness against Ukrainian thermal drones reveals that 20th century military doctrines are inadequate for 21st century combat, that nations that innovate rapidly will defeat nations that rely on established practices, that wars are won by forces that adapt rather than forces that persist with tactics that no longer work. The resilience of Ukrainian military culture, its embrace of innovation, its systematic learning from experience, creates advantages that Russian military culture cannot match regardless of resources invested. That cultural difference may ultimately prove more decisive than any material factor in determining which side prevails. The question haunting every observer tonight is how Russia responds to Ukrainian thermal drone dominance. Does Russian military leadership recognize the need for fundamental doctrinal transformation and attempt reforms that might restore competitive capability? Or does Russian leadership continue attempting incremental technological fixes to problems that are fundamentally organizational and cultural? Does Russia escalate desperately to weapons of mass destruction out of frustration at conventional military failure? Or does Russia accept that military victory is unachievable and seek negotiated settlement before losses become even more catastrophic? The answers depend on decisions made in Moscow by leaders whose judgment has been consistently poor throughout this war. Russian leadership has miscalculated repeatedly, doubling down on failing strategies rather than adapting to changing circumstances. They may miscalculate again, escalating rather than adapting, making situations worse rather than better. The extraordinary risk is that recognition of conventional military failure triggers desperate measures that expand conflict beyond Ukraine's borders or introduce weapons of mass destruction that were previously considered too escalatory. Conventional military weakness in nuclear-armed state creates dangers that conventional military weakness in non-nuclear state does not, because the temptation to escalate when losing conventionally may be irresistible for leaders, facing domestic political consequences from defeat. You can field the largest army and most numerous equipment, but you cannot win if technology allows smaller adversary to destroy your forces faster than you can replace them. You can rely on doctrine and tactics that worked in previous wars, but you cannot succeed when warfare changes fundamentally and your adversary adapts while you persist with obsolete approaches. You can assume darkness provides concealment and respite, but you cannot hide when thermal imaging makes darkness transparent to enemy who innovates faster than you adapt. These are truths that Russian military is learning at catastrophic cost to Russian soldiers who die because their leaders cannot or will not acknowledge how warfare has changed. Tonight, Ukrainian thermal drones dominate night combat in ways that Russian forces cannot counter. Russian forces lose 890 vehicles in 72 hours. Losses they cannot sustain, cannot replace, cannot prevent. Ukrainian forces demonstrate revolutionary capabilities that may determine not just this war's outcome, but how future wars are fought globally. The resilience of Ukrainian innovation, the extraordinary effectiveness of thermal drone operations, the systematic destruction of Russian military capabilities through technological superiority and tactical creativity, all of this demonstrates that determination combined with intelligence defeats raw power, when power is applied stupidly while determination adapts continuously. And it reminds us that wars are won not by nations with most resources, but by nations that use resources most effectively, by forces that learn fastest, by cultures that embrace change rather than resist it. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.